Good morning, all of you. Good to see you. Happy Halloween, Day of the Dead, and welcome everyone online. Thanks for joining us. If you were tried to get online last week, I apologize for the technical difficulties we experienced with Dr. Michael Battle. We were able to eventually get it up, and it was recorded. So if you missed it, it's available on our YouTube channel, the Campbell Center YouTube channel, and I encourage you to check it out. And of course, today's talk is going to be recorded. But fortunately, we were able to get started from the beginning with the Zoom webinar. So thank you all for being here. As a reminder, if you have class at 11, we will pause at 10:50 to allow you to leave all at once without disrupting our guest and any Q&A that's taking place at that time. So if you can stick till then, that should give you plenty of time to get to your 11 o'clock class. We had great fun planning our schedule in the summer, late summer, for our fall speakers forums. And Abby Fell-DeWalt, a seminary student and Eastern alum who's in the program, was a part of this, and we were discussing topics and faculty, and she was super excited to extend an invitation to our guest today. So thanks for responding to that and joining us this morning. We're all excited to hear from you. But Dr. Julia Stewart is a professor emeritus of foreign languages here at Eastern. She taught here from 1999 to 2019, and it sounds like you just taught a course last spring. Adjuncting. So we're grateful to have you still connected to the community and contributing to it. Her expertise is in the area of second language acquisition, as well as Latin American literature. She was the recipient of a Fulbright Award in 2014 to Mexico, where she provided continuing education workshops to ESL instructors at the Universidad de Yucatan, and created a virtual study abroad program linking Mexico University students with American expats living in Merida. She has published and presented on topics related to the acquisition of Spanish in classroom and in the context of study abroad. Dr. Stewart has traveled extensively in Latin America and Europe. Over the years, she has taken groups of students and faculty to Mexico, France, Switzerland, Austria, and Cuba. Before coming to Eastern, Dr. Stewart was director of Spanish language program at the University of Pennsylvania. Previously, she was the assistant dean in the School of Arts and Sciences at the Universidad de las Americas, Pueblo, Mexico. Forgive me for butchering all of that. Her training in French included a year of study at the Université de Paris, Sorbonne. She's incredibly gifted. She's contributed to over 2 decades to our community. And we're so delighted to hear from you this morning on this fitting day. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julia Stewart.
All right. Yes, thank you very much, Robert. Good morning, everybody, all here and online. Really pleased to be able to speak to you today, and it is really fitting that this is October 31st, and we're going to talk about the holidays, not just Dia de los Muertos, but also Halloween in some context at the end. And so I understand that typically what you do is hear from the person, and then we end up with some questions and some maybe discussion. So that's what I hope to do, that we can kind of look at religious syncretism, both in the celebration of Day of the Dead, Dia de Muertos, and also maybe in Halloween as well. Anyway, so that's the plan for today, and I'm very thrilled to be here. I understand that many of you are considering a career in Christian ministry. Is that correct? And I can kind of relate to that wanting to share the good news of Jesus, because when I finished college, I ended up working for a Lutheran mission right across the line. We called it the line. It's the border of Arizona in Nogales, Mexico. And it was there I witnessed the faith of some very dear people, barely surviving amidst great poverty, but who trusted in the goodness of the Lord. And for me, that kind of caused a crisis of faith because I was a new believer and I had just graduated from a Christian university founded on the prosperity doctrine. In those days, the idea was God doesn't want you to have a Volkswagen. He wants you to have a Cadillac. You got to expect the best. And now I was living with Mexican believers who were struggling to feed their families with beans and tortillas. However, eventually I came to understand, not without a lot of soul searching, that how God has chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith, as it says in the book of James. Because I saw the lives of these people living in tin shacks and dusty hill, touched by the power of the gospel. And I witnessed firsthand in such a bleak place the love of Jesus that gives hope to the poor. So I commend your calling and encourage you to seek the Lord with all your heart. What we used to say is worship at the altar of your desk. And as the Apostle Paul says in the letter to Corinthians, eyes have not seen, or your ear heard, neither have entered the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. And that's such a testimony, because now that I'm kind of towards the end of my journey, I can say that we did marvelous things that I never expected. So given your interest in Christian ministry, I've tried to organize my talk in such a way that at the conclusion of the presentation about religious syncretism in Mexico, we might discuss the challenge of syncretism in our own culture. Do we see syncretism at work in our own Christian beliefs in the US? As our country becomes more diverse in religious beliefs and practices, how should we as Christians live in this context of multiple belief systems? And as Dia de Muertos celebrations become more widely practiced in the US, how should we as Christians view these celebrations? Is it okay to participate in the festivities? Take skull painting, for example, faces a skull. That's become more and more popular in the US. So let's begin by defining the word syncretism. So syncretism is made up of two parts from the Greek syn, which means with or together, a synonym, and synthesis, bringing two ideas together. And krasis is mixture. So syncretism is a process that occurs when two, in this case, two cultures inhabit the same space for a period of time. And what happens is they end up borrowing certain aspects from the other culture. And then these foreign beliefs and practices are become melded or joined with their existing beliefs. And in preparing this talk and knowing it was going to be in the chapel, I thought, this is a good experience, because as we sit here surrounded by the beautiful aesthetics of Eastern University and the buildings, I thought it would be good to kind of ask the question, have you, in walking around the university, ever wondered how it is in the middle of the mainline suburban Philadelphia, right, with its Tudor architecture and Georgian estates, that there is this beautiful estate right in the middle, but of Spanish design, with its sandstone walls and its terracotta roofs and so forth. I wondered that for a long time, and I never heard any kind of explanation. And then a few years ago, my husband was invited to speak at a little church in Oxford, Pennsylvania. And we were invited home for lunch with one of the families. And as I walked through the door, a woman said to me, the wife said, "So how are things at Eastern?" And I said, "Oh, are you familiar with the university?" And she said, "I'm a Walton." I said, "Oh, you're a Walton, really? How's that work?" And she said, "Well, that was my great grandfather who built the estate, Martha, they called it." And I said, "Well, then maybe you can explain to me how it is that this Spanish villa is right in the middle of all this other, kind of Tudor estates and Georgian estates." And she said, "Oh, well, when my great grandparents married, it was in the late 1800s, they took an extended honeymoon to Europe, spending several weeks in Spain, because at the end of the 19th century, that was kind of the idea to, as part of your education, if you were a certain means, you did the grand tour. So they spent several weeks in Europe. And she went on to say, my great-grandmother was so enamored with the architecture of Spain that years later, my great-grandfather built her a summer estate. This was originally their summer estate, Walmarthen, resembling what they had seen in Spain. Isn't that cool? Yeah, as we sit here today, we're kind of surrounded by what was synthetic, the syncretism of, in this case, the ideas of what beauty and architecture is, and the influence that one had upon the other. So it's a bit emblematic of what Dia de Muertos is today. It's a combination of Catholic and pre-Hispanic beliefs. In other words, before the Spaniards or anyone came to the New World, that over the years have been fused into kind of a prominent religious holiday in Mexico. It's practiced some in Guatemala and El Salvador, but basically it's a Mexican holiday. And it's ever changing. It's incorporating new elements as time goes on, even a few from our celebration of Halloween. So in turn, we can see how this Mexican celebration of Day of the Dead is being adopted by our own culture. Originally, say about 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, it was more widely practiced in the central and southern parts of Mexico, where there are large indigenous populations of Indian background. In northern Mexico, it wasn't as popular, but nowadays the celebrations have proliferated all over the country, and they've spilled into the US. Here in Philadelphia, the Consulate of Mexico for the last 10 years or so has put up an altar at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And you should go and see it. It's quite elaborate. So it's an altar, such like this is, but decorated with all kinds of flowers and candles and pan de muerto, which I happen to have here. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, as one can see. It has the form of there's a bolita, a little ball in the middle, that's the lagrima, the tear, and then the crossbones in the back. So this is pan de muerto. You can get it in Norristown, Little Mexico. That's where I go for my Mexican food. So let's see. Then even actually, for the first time last year, the Biden administration commemorated Dia de Muertos with a large altar in the White House. And there's one there right now today. In addition, Day of the Dead celebrations have recently garnered the attention of the world stage. In 2003, UNESCO entered the Day of the Dead in its list of masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. So they recognize it as being unique and as worthy of having that recognition. The growing popularity of the holiday has also attracted the attention of the commercial world, as you probably have realized. In 2013, prior to the release of the Pixar movie Coco, the Disney Corporation actually filed an application to copyright the phrase Dia de Muertos and Day of the Dead, hoping to secure the exclusive rights to produce themed merchandise, such as toys, games, clothing, in advance of the movie now. Fortunately, the attempt faced such massive public backlash, accusing Disney of cultural appropriation and exploitation at its worst. Nevertheless, the Pixar movie was released then in 2017, and bringing the traditions surrounding the Day of the Dead to the world's cinematic stage in the winsome narrative of a Mexican family who reconnects with their deceased family members. And the movie Coco has received a lot of praise for its delightful rendition of the holiday, but also some criticism for distorting it. We'll look at that a little bit later. To date, Coco has grossed a total of $800 million worldwide, making it one of Pixar's most popular animated films. So I'd like to break the talk up into actually three aspects of the holiday. We're going to look at what does Day of the Dead commemorate, how's it celebrated, and then how has the process of syncretism shaped the beliefs and practices surrounding Dia de Muertos over time. And then thirdly, in what ways do Mexicans of different social classes, both Catholic and Protestant, respond to this holiday with its mixture of Catholic and pre-Hispanic beliefs? And then afterwards, hopefully this will lead to some sort of discussion about syncretic practices and holidays of our own. So Dia de Muertos is celebrated on November 2nd, but it's actually part of a 2-day religious holiday in Mexico. It's dedicated to the remembrance of the deceased. At least Disney got that right. It's not about ghosts and goblins and chainsaw murderers like Halloween, but rather in its Catholic origins about commemorating the deceased of the Christian faith who are already in heaven. That's November 1st, actually. And for the deceased whose souls are still in purgatory, which is November 2nd. The first official day is November 1st, and we call it All Saints Day. And in the Catholic Church, it's a holy day of obligation, meaning you should go to Mass. And it venerates the martyrs and the saints of the faith. In Mexico, the focus has become more on the children who have died in childhood, because it assumes that if when a child dies in childhood, they are without sin, and therefore they don't have to go into purgatory. Among the more indigenous Mexicans, this Catholic belief has become mingled with certain Aztec beliefs, and also the Mayans of Yucatan have their a similar festival. That the souls of the deceased return to Earth every year to commune with their families for 24 hours before returning to the land of the dead. So it is at noon on October 31st when all over Mexico church bells begin to ring. And that signifies that the souls of the children who have died are on their way back to eat and drink with their families, who set up what are called ofrendas, offerings, on an altar that the family will put on a table with all kinds of photographs of their deceased family members and those beautiful flowers that we talked about that unfortunately I wasn't able to get, but they're like the Mexican chrysanthemums, they're real bright orange. There are candles, flowers, incense, there's water for the spirits because they might be thirsty on their way back. Tamales, sugar skulls. Actually, I kind of brought one along here. I'm going to show the audience online. So these sugar skulls are sold a couple weeks before Day of the Dead, and you can have your friend's name inscribed there on the top of it as a present to your friends. Sounds a little bit macabre for us, but that's not, it's all in the spirit of fun, actually. And then that special bread, pan de muerto, as I demonstrate to you, pan de muerto. This is a really big one, with its crossbones and single tear, is placed on the altar, and then later the family eats it at supper. Mexicans who create these altars in their homes believe that the souls of the dead partake of the essence. So they return in spirit, they commune with the family, and they take with them the essence of the pan de muerto and the tamales and the water as they return to for their return. Because the Aztecs believed there was the land of the dead where they would return, and Mexicans sort of believe that they go back to either, well, if it's deceased children, it would be back to heaven. And on those, for November 2nd, it's the souls of the adults who return. First they return at midnight on November 1st, and then when they go back 24 hours later, they go back to purgatory. In Mexico, holidays are never celebrated by the family alone, such as we celebrate Thanksgiving, sort of a reduced group, but with the larger community. This is so important. Hispanic culture is about community, right? So beginning on November 1st, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans visit the cemetery, where they wash down the gravestones of their deceased family members and place armfuls of these beautiful flowers, cempasúchiles. They're bright orange. I researched it, it says Mexican marigolds, but they kind of look like the chrysanthemums on the grave. In the more indigenous areas of Mexico, the families might spend the whole night seated around the tombstone, eating and talking while woeful songs are strung on the guitar. And then there's the ubiquitous cohetes, fireworks that brighten the sky. And these celebrations in some areas have become very popular with tourists. And so that they could be, there's thousands of people that go to some of these events from international as well as Mexicans as sort of tourists. In the cities, though, families they stroll back and forth in the town, both rich and poor, visiting other ofrendas. And in this case, oftentimes the cultural center, the community center in the town will set up ofrendas for teachers who have died. So school children might celebrate a teacher who has passed away with, again, an altar and things that were particular to that person. And other altars might be for civic organizations. And the prizes are given to the most elaborate of these ofrendas. So you just have people coming and going, seeing all these beautiful displays of color. In school, children actually are asked to write calaveritas, which are little poems about someone who has died. And newspapers publish satirical verse describing how current Mexican political figures will meet their death. Only in the spirit of fun. In fact, I brought a little thing here. This is kind of, what they would illustrate the poem with, one of these figures that are calaverita. So that's fair game on Day of the Dead, that you can criticize those in authority in the country. And this practice of illustrating the calaveritas with figures such as this was begun in the early 1900s. There was an illustrator, an engraver named Guadalupe Posada, who began illustrating these poems that were harpooning the politicians of the day. And I'm sure you've seen the skeleton, La Catrina with the big hat as she parades around oftentimes in parades in the city, or also Diego Rivera has included her as a figure. So from that point on, the idea of these calaveritas, skeletons dressed as particular figures, has taken over and become the iconic symbol of Dia de Muertos. As I said, in Mexico, commemorating the dead each year is not just limited to family remembrances, but it functions as a cohesive cultural force that unites towns and villages in a type of shared memory of deceased neighbors and friends in the community. So as early as October 28th, you begin to see all over the countryside and the highways and streets large bouquets of cempasúchitos that kind of dot the scenery, marking the exact spot where the individual died, oftentimes in car accidents, or it could be other things, but in that exact spot. And although they're placed by the bereaved family, these colorful flowers create for the community an ongoing shared remembrance of those who died tragically. And so the last week in October and the first week in November, the whole country of Mexico is sort of visually bathed in remembrance. It's quite a thing to see. And I would say sensorially bathed, because the smell of pan de muerto wafts out of the bakeries, and you buy it, it's in your home. And so there's a smell associated with it. I came to understand how these shared memories work when I was living in Puebla, Mexico, a long time ago now, but I was teaching at the Universidad de las Americas, and I had a housekeeper, Doña Celerina. And the custom in Mexico, if you're sort of upper middle class, which professionals are, you have a housekeeper, oftentimes who lives with you. But in this case, Doña Celerina, I would go and pick her up in the morning. She was a woman about in her 50s and of Aztec descent. She had a very indigenous face. And she, once in a while, she would let on that she understood Nahuatl, Aztec, that her parents used to speak Nahuatl. So I'd pick her up in the morning and bring her back to my house on campus to do the housework and to care for my infant daughter. One year, it was late October, and I had gone to get her, and the route was just dotted with these bouquets of cempasúchitos. So on the way back, she started to say, Señora, you know that this is so-and-so, and that's so-and-so. And she would point out who all these people were that had died right in the community along the way. And that the entrance to I lived in the university in a gated community of houses for professors. And as we reached the gated, the door, the gate, she said, "Oh, you see those flowers there? Well, that was Don Lupe, who happened to jump off the bus. The bus would stop right there in front of the gate. And one day, he tripped and he fell, and the wheels of the bus just ran right over him And there he lay, there he lay, bien muerto, really dead, she said. And then there was another bouquet across the street, right across the street from this one. And she said to me, one year there was a brother and sister who was returning from school, and it was during the monsoon rainstorms, and the streets fill up with water because the drainage system is not real great. And they tried to jump over the flooded street, not knowing that someone had removed the man cover underneath, and they both went down the sewer. And she said, and then ended up a block away, bien muerto, really dead. So, as an American coming from a culture that goes to great lengths to protect its citizens from accidents, I went home and cried at how precarious life it was in Mexico. How could this be? But I'm sure that even now, 30 some years later, there are still these bouquets, those same, marking those same people, because it's a community remembrance, right? So now let's look at the second point. How have these beliefs been shaped by religious syncretism? Well, most scholars trace the present Day of the Dead practices in Mexico to celebrations as far back as the Celts and the Druids in Scotland and Ireland, who believed that their pagan god, Samhain, the Lord of the Dead, gathered the condemned souls together once a year to direct where they should inhabit the next year. So the Celtic year began at sundown at the end of the autumn harvest. And the two big holidays that divided the year was one in April and May, and the other, the Samhain, was between October 31st and November 1st. Believing the barrier between this world and the underworld could be breached during Samhain, the Celts prepared offerings that were left outside villages and fields to placate the restless souls of the dead. And so the people would dress up as animals and monsters so that the spirits were not tempted to kidnap them. When the first Christian missionaries showed up in what is now Scotland and Ireland in the 4th century, instead of doing away with these religious customs, the idea was how can we co-opt them? How can we bring these customs fold them into a Christian practice? So it was Pope Boniface IV in 609 AD that first Christianized the celebration of Samhain by creating a holy day on May 13th. At first, he said it was May 13th to commemorate the martyrs and saints of the church. But despite this attempt, the bonfire festivals of October and November of the Celts continued for the next couple of centuries. So then in 837 AD, Pope Gregory III moved the Christian celebration of the saints to the time of the Celtic fire festivals, which was November 1st, making it a holy day of obligation where the faithful attend Mass and offer prayers venerating the saints. So that became what we now call All Saints' Day. Actually, it was All Hallows' Day, which begins on the evening of October 31st. And in those days, groups of poor people, especially children, would go door to door collecting soul cakes in exchange for praying for the dead, especially the dead of the giver's friends and relatives. Then in the 11th century, the church introduced the ceremony of praying for the dead who are in purgatory. So this day, it's not a holy day of obligation in the Catholic Church, but it is a day when special masses are said for the dead in hopes of shortening their time in purgatory for purification. And then in 1521, when the Spaniards conquered what is now Mexico, Hernán Cortés and all that, they brought in Franciscan friars to Christianize the indigenous people, like the Celts in Scotland and Ireland. The indigenous people, largely Aztecs and Mayans, had elaborate ideas about the underworld and what happens at death. So these Mexica or Aztec people, they had two main ceremonies honoring the dead. One was for adults and the other was for children. In the 9th month of the Aztec calendar, which would be August, the Mexica people offered cempasúchitos, this flower, for the souls of the deceased children to Mictlantecutli, the Lord of the Dead. And their custom was to bury the corpse of the deceased in a woven mat under the house. Actually, they didn't have cemeteries. They placed the bodies under the house, and then they had a ceremony of accompanying the dead to Mictlan, the land of the dead. And this journey could take as long as 4 years. It wasn't without risks. We could encounter quicksand or valleys of obsidian knives, and there was finally a rushing river before you could cross over. And then they would also place the favorite food of the deceased with them in the burial in case they encountered hunger on the way. So archaeologists have found these things in the grave sites as they've dug up Aztec grave sites. And in many of them, they've also found corpses of the Mexican hairless dog. Have you ever seen Xochitl buried with the dead to guide them on their way? My Aztec pronunciation is not the best. It's complicated. It's PL. Practice PL as an English speaker. It's not easy. The famous Mexican writer Octavio Paz, who passed away in the late 90s, he won the Nobel Prize in 1990. He used the traditions of the dead as a lens through which to explain the psychology of the Mexican people, believing these practices reflect the Mexicans' view of death, life and death. So I'm going to just read you a little paragraph of what he wrote in the sort of book essay called The Labyrinth of Solitude. Paz says this: death revenges us against life. It strips it of all its vanities and pretensions and converts it into what it really is: a few neat bones and a dreadful grimace. In a closed world where everything is death, only death has value. But our affirmation is negative. Sugar candy skulls and tissue paper skulls and skeletons strung with fireworks. Our popular images always poke fun at life, affirming the nothingness and insignificance of human existence. We decorate our houses with death's heads. We eat bread in the shape of bones on the Day of the Dead. We love the songs and stories in which death laughs and cracks jokes. But all this boastful familiarity does not rid us of the question we all ask: what is death? We have not thought up a new answer. And each time we ask, we shrug our shoulders and say, why should I care about death if I've never cared about life? Interesting perspective, isn't it? And so this brings us to our third consideration. How do Mexicans of different social classes celebrate the holiday? Are there differences? Are there those that refuse to celebrate the holiday because it does not reflect their own beliefs? Well, as I said, nowadays it's mostly the indigenous that put altars in their homes. They're baptized Catholics, but it's sort of a folk Catholicism that has incorporated other beliefs. But they believe that the spirits of their family members actually do return to the home where they lived and partake of the essence of the food that's there on the family altar. And oftentimes, if it's a small village, they will trace out the path with petals from the cempasúchitls that lead from the cemetery to the home. Coco, in the movie Coco, they show that. So while the lower classes tend to be more indigenous, the middle and what's called upper middle class, which is professional people, they're more mixed, mestizo of Spanish with Indian blood. The large majority are baptized Catholics. And while they don't put up altars in their homes and fewer attend mass, they do join hundreds of thousands of Mexicans who visit the cemetery to clean off the graves for their family members. It's the day of the year where you go and you do that. And they might visit the altars around town and the cultural centers. They oftentimes eat the foods. They buy tamales, and certainly Pan de Muerto, everybody eats as a special day. Now that Walmart and Costco stores have invaded the large urban centers of Mexico, you should see what it looks like on a Sunday. It's packed full of people. It's very popular. These are mostly upper middle class families, the professional class, and desiring to seem more international and sort of cool by their peers, they are the ones that are buying Halloween costumes for their children these days, inviting their friends to parties in their homes. And so this is kind of a new thing. It's the upper middle class that is beginning to celebrate Halloween. But then again, the indigenous children have for some years adopted sort of a Halloween tradition where they carve out little pumpkins and then they put a candle in the middle and they'll go around asking for money. So when I lived in Mexico, they came to the door and you'd answer and they'd say, "Queremos Halloween, queremos Halloween." You know, we want Halloween. And you were supposed to drop coins. I never could figure out. I mean, it would hit the candle and go down in the, but that's what the tradition is. And so some customs of Halloween have been adapted. And then finally, nowadays, there's a growing number of Protestants in Mexico. All over Latin America, this is happening. In fact, the last 40 years, Mexico has undergone a Protestant Reformation of sorts. So now there are Baptist and Presbyterian churches and non-denominational mega churches and charismatic churches, and they've sprung up all over the country. In fact, Christianity Today reports that the Catholic majority in Mexico is now decreasing rapidly with the number of Protestants / evangelicals in the country. In 2010, in the census, they were 7.5%, and in 2020, now they're up to 11.2%. And it's Protestant churches, whether in the cities or in the indigenous areas, do not practice the customs associated with these two holidays because they believe they're contrary to the Bible. They may hold fall festivals in their churches, or they'll buy pan de muerto and maybe eat tamales, but they don't have their faces painted, or they don't go to the cemetery and decorate the grave with flower, well, with this kind of thing of offerings. So here's the question. As the number of Mexicans grow in the US and more Dia de Muertos celebrations proliferate, is there danger that these practices might shape our beliefs as Christians going forward? Sounds a little strange, but here's a case in point. The Disney movie Coco. I just rewatched it the other night. The film got rave reviews for its authentic description or depiction of the holiday. But if you actually analyze it, at the end, the conclusion totally de-Christianizes the holiday. It turns out that death is, it's seen kind of as a materialistic view, because there's a character that when no one else on earth remembers him anymore, poof, he disappears. And it's a little bit disturbing for a children's movie, but he disintegrates into nothingness when the last family member dies. So that's very different than what the heretofore the idea of Dia de Muertos is. So I wonder if, with thanks to this movie, that somehow Disney movies transform our understanding of all kind of literary classics. The process of syncretism might eventually shape the popular Mexican understanding of death going forward. Well, we'll see. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to hear your thoughts about religious syncretism. And since today is October 31st, we can begin with Halloween. It's not a religious holiday in the US, but should we be dressing up and decorating our houses with skeletons and jack-o'-lanterns? Is there danger in this for a Christian? Should we propose alternatives? Is there a way to sort of redeem the holiday? Or do we just do like everybody else? And then we might, if we had time, talk about other syncretic practices that surround Easter and Christmas and so forth. So would you like to